Let's talk about the Trump-Putin summit that's going on right now as we speak in Alaska. Donald Trump has really given off mixed signals. He's talked about possibly having a follow up meeting. He wants to have a follow up meeting with Putin after this meeting, and he wants for the second meeting to have in attendance Mr. Zelensky. Before this meeting occurred, the European leaders had a video meeting or a video chat with Donald Trump, pushing him to agree to certain actions, certain protocols for the meeting with Putin. The Europeans told Donald Trump, well, we want you to tell Mr. Putin that there will be no relinquishing of any sort of Ukrainian territories. We want you to have Putin agree to a ceasefire before doing any other agreements. So the Europeans are making their demands to Donald Trump, but let's be real here, the Europeans are not in a position to have such power. They are not in the position of strength. The only country that is in a position of strength right now is Russia. That's it. Russia is the only country that has a position of serious strength right now. And this is the reason why the Americans are seeking this meeting. Donald Trump has tried to use financial pressure on the Russians. For example, he imposed a 50% tariff on Indian imports in order to punish the Indians for being adamant about purchasing Russian oil. And it hasn't worked. Donald Trump said days and days ago, well, he has until this day to end the war in Ukraine, or else I'm going to impose serious sanctions on him. And then that day came, that deadline came, and nothing happened. So now we have this meeting. And the reason why we're having this meeting is because we know for a fact that the Ukrainians cannot beat the Russians. And we know for a fact that the only way to beat the Russians is if the United States did a full-on military deployment against Russia. That is it. And we are not right now in a good position to be getting into a full-on major conventional war with the most nuclear-armed country in the world right now. So we have decided to have a meeting, and we have decided to utilize diplomacy. Because Russia is just not going to stop. Russia is not going to stop. In fact, even after the Alaska Summit was announced, Russia just continued on taking more territory. Russia has continued on taking more territory, and Russia has gotten deeper into Ukraine. We're talking about within eastern Ukraine here. So Russia's just not going to stop. So what do? You have to utilize diplomacy. Or the other option is to declare war on Russia. And that would be utterly destructive, and you don't have to be a geopolitical analyst or an expert to realize this reality. So, is this Alaska summit going to fully settle the Ukraine war? No, it's not. Whatever will be agreed upon in this summit will already have been agreed upon before the summit. Whatever will be agreed upon in the Alaska summit would already have been agreed upon before the summit even began. So the agreements have already been made. That's a given. And if this war is going to be paused, because I don't think it's ever going to fully end, it's just going to pause. But even if there is a pause, the fighting will resume, because this is about more than just ceasefire or no ceasefire. This is about truly a struggle between empires. So the fight is going to resume itself. That's just the reality. But if there is a pause in the fighting and an agreement is made, territory will have to be conceded. Lands will have to be relinquished. And by that, we're talking about Ukraine giving up territory and borders being changed. And this could lead to serious political instability in Ukraine. In fact, there are analysts in Russia who are saying that if territory is given up by the Ukrainians officially, there will be serious political instability that will spark in Ukraine against Zelensky and his government. The Ukrainian nationalists, the hardliners, the Azov battalion types will declare war on Zelensky, and they will want him dead, and they will want to basically lynch mob him. And this was already quite obvious, even going as far back as 2019, when Ukrainian Nazis said that if Zelensky ever gave up any territory, that they would kill him. So I wouldn't be surprised to see in the near future Zelensky moving out of Ukraine and buying a house somewhere in the United States or perhaps somewhere in the European Union. I did hear that he purchased a lot of real estate in both the United States and Italy. So it looks like that was a sign of his future plans to escape for his life, because the hardliners in Ukraine are still very substantial. The people who worship Bandera and Adolf Hitler are still a substantial political faction. They have a lot of guns, and they have a lot of anger. And think of it this way. Think of it. Think about this. Let's say Zelensky says, okay, in order to have peace, we will relinquish some territories, Zaporizhia, Donbass region, Luhansk, Donetsk, we will have to, no choice but to give up. But we will not officially recognize those lands as Russian territory or as part of Russian Federation. We will always consider those lands to be occupied Ukrainian territory. If Zelensky does this, then all the hardliners, imagine the optics. Jewish guy, right? Imagine the optics in the perspective of a Nazi, Ukrainian ultranationalist, Banderite, who admires Adolf Hitler. Zelensky, Jewish comedian, has sold out on Ukraine and has stabbed the Ukrainian people in the back for the sake of Russia and the United States. Just imagine the optics. It would be reminiscent to General Ludendorff's stab in the back analogy after World War I, when Germany lost the war, and then what happened? Germany had lost a lot of territory to the French, and Ludendorff comes along and says, the Jews stabbed us in the back because supposedly during World War I, a bunch of Jewish activists stoked up some labor protests, and a bunch of workers who were laboring in Germany's defense factories stopped working, and that lessened the amount of munitions that were necessary for the German war machine, and the German war advancement began to weaken, and that led to Germany, or that contributed at least to Germany losing the war. Ludendorff said that the worker strikes were fomented by a bunch of Jewish troublemakers and activists, and so he said the Jews stabbed us in the back. Also keep in mind that the biggest defense industrialist in Germany during the time of World War I was a Jewish guy by the name of Walter Rathenau, and so he was blamed for the weakening of Germany's war industry. And so Ludendorff put together this entire narrative, and eventually a far-right German nationalist assassinated Walter Rathenau, and this happened before the rise of Adolf Hitler. So imagine the optics in Ukraine if Zelensky gives up territory. This Jewish guy, this Jew comedian, has stabbed Ukraine in the back and has given up Ukrainian territory that we spilt Ukrainian blood for. And there would be an entire campaign against Zelensky by a bunch of Nazis. And Zelensky would have to run for his life. So it wouldn't surprise me if Zelensky moves out of the country in the future. Because Russia right now is in the position of strength, Russia right now is in the position of FU, Russia can definitely call the shots. Russia definitely has leverage to call the shots. And Russia is going to demand for Ukrainian territory to be officially recognized as part of the Russian Federation. Or he's going to request some sort of concessions on territory, and perhaps the Russians will specify that the Ukrainians don't have to recognize that area as official Russian territory, but still, it's going to be Russian territory. No matter how you look at it, if this whole nightmare is going to be settled, albeit temporarily, through diplomatic measures, land is going to have to be given up. We said this months ago. I said this months ago. Other people were saying the same thing. And remember what I said. Remember what I said months and months ago. You can see it on my channel. I made it into an excerpt for my channel, but it was from a live stream that I did months ago. I said, Donald Trump is interested in a show. He is interested in reality TV. And he has quite effectively integrated reality TV with politics. He is a marketer at the end of the day. And remember what happened months and months ago. Rubio met with the Russians and nothing happened. The Americans had a delegation that met with Russian delegates and nothing happened. And the Russians told the Americans, we can continue this war on forever. And the meeting amounted to nothing. Zip. Nada. Nothing. And what did Donald Trump say after that meeting, after that failed meeting? He said, I'm going to have to meet with Putin, and I'm going to have to do it myself. This is what Donald Trump said. I remember because I commentated on it in a live stream. And then I took that part of the live stream and made it into a separate video. You can find it on my channel. And I said, Donald Trump is interested in a show. And Donald Trump's whole plan is to have this grandiose meeting, this world attention-grabbing meeting with Putin, with the hopes that the war will at least be paused long enough for him to say, I stopped the war. And then if the war resumes once he has left office or after he's gone and is no longer the president, Donald Trump, if he is still alive by then, will say, I put an end to it. And there was peace until after I left. This is why you needed me. And because he wants to establish this legacy as a peacemaker. But the Europeans feel left out because no European politician has been invited to this meeting. The Ukrainians feel like the fate of Ukraine is being strictly determined by the Russians and the Americans, because it is. Because Ukraine is not a powerful country. Ukraine is nothing, really. It's just a piece of territory that's within Russia's sphere of influence. It has no say-so in this situation, even though it is one of the two belligerents in this war. But Ukraine has no say-so because it's the loser in this whole equation. As Donald Trump told Zelensky when he was berating him, and he was tag-teaming with Vance to berate Zelensky in the White House, you don't have the cards. And he was right. Remember, Donald Trump told him that? He said, you don't have the cards. And he doesn't have the cards. So Ukraine has zero say-so in all of this. The Europeans have no say-so because, well, they're also sort of the losers in this whole situation because while they haven't been fighting directly against the Russians, they've definitely been accomplices with the Ukrainians against the Russians. The British allowed the Ukrainians to use far-range British missiles. What do they call them? Storm Shadows. The British allowed the Ukrainians to use Storm Shadows against Russian territory. The Americans also allowed for long-range American missiles to be used by the Ukrainians against Russian territory. And the Germans recently stated that they will be giving German long-range missiles to the Ukrainians to use against Russia itself. So the Americans and the European Union, the Germans, the British, have definitely been accomplices in this war, and they're losing. That's it. The Americans and the Europeans, especially the Germans, have been huge contributors. They have been huge sources for weapons and other aid to the Ukrainians, and it's been a failure. The Germans have sent tanks. The Germans have sent guns. It's been a failure. The British have provided intelligence to the Ukrainians. It's been a failure. The Americans also. It's been a failure. Even though the Russians have also been losing a lot of soldiers, the Russians are the winners, albeit it's been, and to be fair, it's been for the Russians a sort of, I don't want to say exactly a Pyrrhic victory, but I guess one could make the argument that it's somewhat of a Pyrrhic victory, because from what I have read, the Russians have had a lot of casualties, a lot of dead and a lot of wounded. So the way I look at it is Russia is the winner, and Russia is saying, we're going to continue this war unless there's some sort of a settlement. At the same time, though, to be fair, the way I see it is the Russians also want a pause in the fighting. Even though they're technically winning, the Russians also want a pause in the fighting because they want the time and they want the rest to then assess their mistakes, to advance their own military innovation, and to replenish their ranks, to replenish their soldiers with new recruits. But I think out of all of the parties, the Russians are going to get the best deal because they're winning. And I think the Russians are going to get Ukrainian territory, and that Ukrainian territory will be relinquished under the superintendence of the United States. That's my prediction. I could be wrong, but that is my prediction. I'm not saying that this is going to be agreed upon right after this meeting, but what I will say is that this meeting is setting the stage for more diplomatic talks to be done in order to make some sort of a ceasefire / pause in the fighting, armistice, whatever you want to call it. What would Europe do when their old status quo failed? Well, the Europeans, and we'll talk more about this later on, the Europeans want to become relevant again. And in order to become relevant, the Europeans are going to have to make a giant pan-European military. The Germans are at the center of this pan-European militarist revival, and the Germans are really the muscle behind it. They have the money, they have the innovation, they have the industry, and they are soon going to be surpassing the military spending of France. The Germans are on their way to becoming at least the third largest military spender in the world. So there's that. The Germans want to make themselves relevant because right now they're not as relevant as they want to be. Right now they're being sidelined by the Americans. Right now their demands are not exactly being respected. Their demands for Ukraine. So let's talk a little bit about this for a moment, and then we'll get into the news as best as we can, because we're looking at this whole Alaska summit thing in real time, so we have to wait to be fed the information and all the details on what's happening with that. But I'll just give you guys quickly my thoughts on Germany in this whole situation. So the Germans are not really relevant, but they want to become relevant. How are they going to do that? They're going to have to make a massive military power. And as Merz has said, as Olaf Scholz said not too long ago, Germany will become really the biggest military in all of Europe. So they are working on that, and they have been working fairly quickly for this objective. And so we have to really expect, and we should be expecting, for a German militarist revival. We should be expecting to see the revival of Germany in Europe, and we should be expecting to see Germany becoming a serious powerhouse for foreign policy, a serious powerhouse in the world, one that other countries, even Russia, will respect. So there's that. The Europeans are saying, listen, we were not invited to this meeting. Are the Americans going to respect us, et cetera, et cetera? And with all these questions lingering about, the Germans are saying, we can't really rely on the Americans because, look, the Americans are meeting with Putin. We don't really know what sort of agreement the Russians and the Americans will come to, and we don't even know if these agreements will be to our benefit, and what if they're not to our benefit? We don't really want to sit here and be at the mercy of America's or Russia's arbitration, so we have to become the most powerful country in all of Europe. Now, also, we have to factor in the historical reality in all of this. This is Ukraine that we're talking about. Ukraine historically has been a part of Russia. During the Cold War, it was a part of the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union, Russia considered Ukraine to be a part of its sphere of influence. So after the Cold War, Ukraine became independent, but even after its independence, officially, the Russians said it's still part of our sphere of influence, so better stay away, NATO. And this is the whole reason why this war broke out in the first place, because NATO kept mingling in with Ukraine and participating in Ukraine's politics against the interest of the Russians. But also, historically speaking, the Germans have considered Ukraine to be a part of their sphere of influence. And if you don't believe me, just look at what happened during World War I. What happened during World War I? The Russian Empire fell during World War I. How did it fall? Well, a lot of people hated the Tsar. A lot of the people who were under the Russian Empire, they were sick of the Tsar. There was a lot of resentment within the poor peasant classes of Russia, a lot of hatred against the Tsar. So the Germans took advantage of this, and they hired Mr. Vladimir Lenin to do the Bolshevik Revolution in exchange for Russia leaving the war. So the Bolshevik Revolution was a success because Russia was a dying body anyway, and the Germans and the Bolsheviks were just vultures waiting for the thing to die. So they all knew it was easy to make the Russian Empire crumble anyway. So they hired Vladimir Lenin, gave Mr. Lenin an ungodly amount of gold. We're talking tens of millions of dollars worth in gold to fund the Bolshevik Revolution. And eventually there was a revolution. Now, the Tsar had already fallen at this point. I should have mentioned that earlier, but the Tsar had fallen already at this point, and the Russian government was a very, very weak and fragile government that was going to fall at any moment. And so the Germans made it happen. Russian Empire fell. And then there was the Brest-Litovsk meeting that took place, I want to say in 1918 or 1917, somewhere around there. Regardless, during the Brest-Litovsk conference, the Germans and the Turks and the Bulgarians met up with the representatives of the Bolshevik government and basically said, all right, Russia, your empire has fallen. You guys are weak, and you guys are no longer in the war because you're weak. And so we're just going to demand a bunch of territory to be given up. And the Russians said, okay. The Bolsheviks said, okay, what do you want? And the Germans said, we want Ukraine. Let it go. And the Russians gave up Ukraine. And the Germans said, okay, Ukraine is in our sphere of influence. And during World War II, the Germans and the Soviets were fighting over Ukraine. And the Germans took over Ukraine. And the Germans took over Poland. And part of Poland overlapped with territory that once belonged to Ukraine. And so there were all these ethnic Ukrainians who were living in Poland, and the Germans worked with those people to butcher a lot of Polish people, and that's why you had the whole Banderite movement getting armed and empowered by the Third Reich. So historically, if you look at World War I and World War II, Ukraine was also in the crosshairs of the Germans. So let's fast forward to today. You had the Euromaidan of 2014, the Ukrainian nationalist revolt against a government that was sort of friendly with the Russians. They didn't like that. They overthrew that government. They got a new government. And this whole coup or this whole Euromaidan revolution was backed by NATO. It was backed by the Americans. The what is it called? The National Endowment for Democracy poured in millions upon millions of dollars into this Euromaidan movement. So it was obviously a NATO-backed coup. And then you had a nationalist government. A lot of Banderites entered the Ukrainian parliament. And then you had a civil war break out between those who were pro-Russia and those who were anti-Russia. And this civil war was taking place in eastern Ukraine. So fast forward 2022, eventually the Russians invade all of Ukraine. But before the Russians invaded Ukraine, the Germans and the Americans were backing the Nazis in eastern Ukraine. They were backing the Azov Battalion because they really wanted to weaken Russia's position in that country. And the Germans were saying, this civil war in Ukraine is our opportunity. This is our, not opportunity, but what the Germans were saying was that the civil war in Ukraine and Russia's involvement in Ukraine, backing the pro-Russian forces in the Donbass, is our signal to really, really begin boosting Germany's military capacity. And this was being said back in 2018, 2017, 2016, especially after Brexit. And the Germans were saying, we have to prepare for Russia. But what was at the center? What was the fulcrum in the midst of all of this discourse? The fulcrum, the hinge upon which this whole discourse was being expressed was Ukraine. We have to fight for Ukraine. That's what this whole thing is centered on. We have to make Europe powerful again. Why? Ukraine. We got to make the German military powerful again. Why? Ukraine. Ukraine is at the center of this entire discourse on reviving German military strength. And the Germans, really under the radar and really without getting much attention, have been quickly accelerating the process of militarism in Germany. And I'm going to talk more about this. There was an excellent article that was published in the German media recently that talks about just how fast the Germans have been working to boost up their military capacity. And it's happening as we speak. It's happening in real time. But when you look at the militarist rhetoric that's been going on in the German media, in the German political circles, it's really all about Ukraine and stopping the Russians. Just as the Germans were focused on Ukraine in World War I, just as the Germans were focused on Ukraine in World War II. Why such a huge focus on Ukraine? Well, you could say it's natural resources, natural gas and all that. And that's absolutely true. But there's also an agricultural component in this as well. During World War I, the Germans were really focused on Ukraine's agriculture. The soil, not all of the soil, but much of the soil in Ukraine, especially when you get into the Black Sea region, is extremely fertile. You can practically grow anything, but you can grow almost anything there, especially wheat. Ukraine is a major breadbasket. Adam Tooze, in his book, The Deluge, which is an excellent book on the whole geopolitical ramifications of World War I, talks about this, and he says that during World War I, Ukraine was seen as the breadbasket because it was, and the Germans wanted it. So fast forward to what we're seeing right now. The Americans and the Russians are having this summit in Alaska. The Europeans are not invited. The Ukrainians are not invited. And the Europeans are saying, okay, how can we trust the Americans? How can we rely on the Americans not to do things that are against our interest? How can we rely on the Americans not to do things that are in the interest of Russia? Perhaps the Americans will make concessions on Ukrainian territory. And then what? Is America truly a reliable ally in this regard? So that's going to, if this happens, and I think it will, that's going to encourage the Europeans to further accelerate its militarist ambition. And Turkey was just given a big fat reward. Just given a big fat reward. Very interesting. Very interesting. I did a couple of videos on this, but Donald Trump had a meeting with the leader of Armenia, Mr. Pashinyan, and the leader of Azerbaijan, Mr. Aliyev, Ilham Aliyev. And what did the Armenians agree to? Really, I mean, the Armenians, let's be real here. The poor Armenians are doing everything at the point of a gun, at the end of a barrel, because the Armenians, let's be real, they're surrounded by a bunch of Turks who hate them. They're sandwiched in between Azerbaijan. They're right next to Turkey. They share a massive border with Turkey. I mean, they are surrounded by not just minor enemies. This is not like, oh, Mexico and Guatemala, they're soccer rivals. This is not, England and Scotland. They used to be big enemies back in the day, but right now they're just sort of, football thug enemies, you could say, right? These aren't minor enemies. These are existential enemies. These are enemies that have historically worked to genocide the Armenians. And the Armenians are surrounded by these people. And so Armenia is working at the end of a barrel. Donald Trump has a meeting with Pashinyan and Aliyev. And who was the loser in this meeting? I don't have to tell you guys. Everyone knows the loser in this meeting. Everyone knows. It's Armenia. Armenia is the loser in all of this political quagmire. Azerbaijan is a winner. Turkey is a winner. Israel is a winner. Why do I say this? As I've said in my past videos, Armenia literally agreed to give up its border to the Americans. Gave up its border. Our border with Iran, you guys have it. Our border with Azerbaijan, Azerbaijan has it. Our border with Turkey, Turkey got it. Because what was agreed upon? What was agreed upon was Armenia will give up its border to the Americans, its border with Iran to the Americans, which means if this plan is implemented, NATO is going to be smack right next to Iran in Armenia. That's going to be a threat to the Iranians. And the Iranians are saying, listen, don't do this because you are now going to be a potential threat to our access to Georgia, which is our access way into the Black Sea. We don't want this. If you look at a map, you'll see Iran is here, and then there's Armenia, right? There's a little small border that Iran shares with Armenia, and then Armenia is this very thin, narrow country. And then north of Armenia is Georgia, and then from Georgia you go into the Black Sea. Armenia is a very landlocked country. But the thing is that Armenia is Iran's most reliable ally. Why do I say most reliable? It's its most reliable access way by land to Georgia and thus to the rest of Europe and thus to the Black Sea. Why do I say it's Iran's most reliable ally? Or most reliable access way by land? Because yes, Iran shares a big border with Azerbaijan. Yes, Iran shares a big border with Turkey. The problem is that Turkey and Azerbaijan are part of NATO. Turkey is a major member of NATO. Azerbaijan is within NATO's sphere of influence and power. So Azerbaijan and Turkey are not the most reliable access ways for Iran to go to Georgia and thus to the Black Sea. So Armenia is very, very important. Armenia is very important to Iran, geopolitically speaking. So this is all about isolating the Iranians, and it's also about bypassing the Russians. This is where Europe comes into play in this agreement brokered by Trump between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Because if you look at a map, you'll see Russia is here, and then you have Georgia, Azerbaijan, you have Armenia, and then you have Iran here. So you have the North Caucasus, South Caucasus, and then you have Iran. Well, the Caspian Sea is right next to Azerbaijan. On the other side of the Azerbaijani side of the Caspian Sea is Central Asia. Central Asia is a major source for oil, natural gas, and uranium. The Europeans import energy from Central Asia. But the problem is there's no direct trade route from Europe into Central Asia. Now, if the Americans take control of the Armenian side of the border with Iran, and NATO builds a giant railway system from Turkey through Nakhchivan, through Armenia, through Azerbaijan, and ends at the Caspian Sea, that would be a direct link between Turkey/Europe, because Turkey is a part of Europe, a direct link from Europe into Central Asia, thereby allowing the Europeans to import natural gas from Central Asia directly into Europe while bypassing the Russians. So this is about isolating the Russians. It's about empowering Europe. It's also about empowering Turkey. And by making this agreement, if NATO builds a railway system linking Turkey with the Caspian Sea, it'll be a little needle jabbing at Russia's underbelly. So it's about weakening the Russians, weakening the Iranians, and as I've already said in a past video, it's about weakening the Chinese. Because if there is a direct link between Turkey and Central Asia, then it would enable the Turks to further influence Central Asia by saying, listen, we have this trade route that connects us, Turkic brothers, together. To hell with the Chinese. Our Turkic brothers are being oppressed in China. The Uyghur Turkic people are being oppressed by the evil communist atheist Chinese. And then that would be perfect propaganda fodder to empower NATO's plan to weaken the Chinese, because then the Turks could possibly stoke up a Turkic Uyghur revolt in China's Xinjiang province, and that would spark a possible civil war that would weaken and drain the Chinese of resources and manpower. So it's about weakening the Chinese. It's about weakening the Iranians. It's about weakening the Russians. And so while Trump is talking about peace with Putin in Alaska, NATO is working against the Russians. The Germans are accelerating their militarism. They're working to make their military more powerful. The Turks are planning on making a railway system that would, or making a trade route that would also consist of infrastructure such as a railway system that would allow the Europeans to bypass the Russians, and that would empower Turkey to further consolidate the other Turkic nations with this idea of creating this pan-Turkic empire. And this pan-Turkic empire would be against the Russians. And this is all being conspired, and it's all being done while there is this summit about peace. So is the summit about peace, or is it really deception? I think right now it's deception. That's what I think. I think right now it's deception. Perhaps the Americans want to pause in the fighting right now. But meanwhile, NATO is working to empower European militarism. Is that for Russia or against Russia? It's against Russia. Now, to be fair, perhaps what is happening is the Europeans have their own interest. Perhaps the Americans want right now, perhaps the Americans are desirous of having trade relations with the Russians. I know the Russians are. And perhaps the Americans really want to do this. Perhaps the Americans really do want peace for the with the Russians. Perhaps, right? Perhaps. We have to be fair here. Perhaps. And if that is the case, still the Europeans are interested in militarism against the Russians. So no matter how you look at it, you can say that this is deception. You can say that the Trump administration sincerely wants peace. No matter how you look at it, the Europeans and their Turkish allies are pursuing establishing themselves as a power against the Russians. So Donald Trump said, I want to see a ceasefire rapidly. I don't know if it's going to be today, but I'm not going to be happy if it's not today. So Donald Trump wants a ceasefire. And remember, the Europeans are pressuring Donald Trump to make a ceasefire happen before any other agreements are made. And the reason for this is because the Europeans want a ceasefire to happen, but they don't want any sort of territorial concessions to be made by the Ukrainians. They don't want any territorial concessions to be forced. So they told Mr. Trump before this meeting occurred that he needs to make sure that a ceasefire is agreed upon before any other agreements. The Europeans do not want the United States to tell the Russians, okay, we'll have the Ukrainians give up some territory, we'll have the Ukrainians give up Donbass. None of that. None of that. The Europeans told Trump, just get a ceasefire and then we'll talk about other agreements. Just get a ceasefire. We don't want any sort of territorial concessions. But here's the problem with that. This has been the problem with all the diplomatic talks since the beginning of this conflict. All of the diplomatic talks have been something like this. Russia, we don't want you to have any territory and we want you to leave. That's it. That's been the talks. That's what Zelensky has been saying for years. Just leave Ukraine. You're going to get nothing. Just leave. That's the deal. Well, how is that a deal if the winning party has to leave empty-handed? That ain't no deal, and that ain't realistic. It would be realistic to say, Russia, we want peace. We'll give you Donbass. We'll give you Zaporizhia, but leave the rest of Ukraine alone. We'll want peace. That is a realistic deal that I could see happening because Russia would not be leaving empty-handed in this regard. But all of this bullshit diplomatic rhetoric of, well, Russia, just leave. Well, what do we get? Nothing. Just leave. Well, bullshit. We're going to keep on fighting them because we're not going to leave empty-handed. So the Europeans are still pressing the Americans to insist on this very unrealistic idea of telling the Russians just to leave empty-handed. The Europeans are still pushing it, which means that the Europeans are not interested in peace. They are interested in war. That's it. Because if they were truly interested in peace, they would be proposing a realistic option. But they're not, and they have never pushed for a realistic option. And the Americans are also guilty of this as well. The British, being the unseen villain that they are, also pushed for this same unrealistic proposal because the British did not want the war to end. And we all know the infamous story of Zelensky being on his way to meet with Putin to talk about peace and to talk about a ceasefire, and Boris Johnson, that Turkic merchant, meeting with Zelensky saying, no, you're not going to do this. Why did the British do that? Because the British are the unseen villain. They are. I was reading an article about this. Our Russian audience member who has Cyrillic letters sent me an article a couple of days ago that I found to be quite interesting. And the article talked about how Churchill was responsible for really contributing to this anti-Russian policy of the Western world. Because, and the article explained this, after World War II, FDR, well, at the end of World War II, FDR was actually really interested in having relations with the Soviet Union. He was not anti-Russia from what I understand. And then FDR died, and then Truman took over, and Truman began to support this anti-Russia policy. But it wasn't just Truman. Churchill also was really into this. And when FDR was really supportive of the idea of having relations with the Russians, Churchill was pushing for war against the Russians. So the more I read about Churchill, the more I don't like him. And the more I read about the British, the more I realize they really are the unseen villain. And I remember talking to a Serbian gentleman years ago, very educated guy, and he told me, he said, Ted, the British are the unseen villain. And he was right. The British are the unseen villain. You can go as far back as the 30 Years' War, and you can see the British were the unseen villain because they were a big contributor to the rise of Protestantism. And then all of a sudden you had a major war break out between the Catholics and the Protestants, and this war would be known as the 30 Years' War. And the British said, well, we're going to set this one out. We're just going to watch from a distance. We're just going to watch. We're not going to get involved. And they watched as Europe killed itself during the 30 Years' War. But they really are the unseen villain. So the Europeans don't want peace. If they did, they would be proposing a realistic plan, but they're not. And even right before the meeting between Trump and Putin in Alaska, the Europeans were pressing Trump to insist to Putin on a very unrealistic deal wherein the Russians would just stop fighting and get zero territorial concessions. That's not how this is going to play out, and that's not how this is going to work. Either this war is going to continue without pause, or concessions will be made. That's the bottom line. And if the Russians are told that they're not going to get anything out of this, then the war is just going to go on. It's not going to stop. How a call from Trump ignited a frantic week of diplomacy by Ukraine. Moscow, Mr. Trump told them, was ready to halt hostilities under a deal involving a territorial exchange. So Trump spoke with some European representatives, and he also spoke with Mr. Zelensky. And it says here that stopping in the small city of Romny, Ukraine, Zelensky listened on a secure line with other European leaders as Mr. Trump outlined Russia's proposal to end the war. So it says here, Moscow, Mr. Trump told them, was ready to halt hostilities under a deal involving a territorial exchange between Russia and Ukraine, according to a Kiev-based European diplomat and a top Ukrainian official who were briefed on the call and spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive information. Seeing a chance to broker peace, Mr. Trump told those on the line that he would meet one-on-one with President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia to try to seal an agreement. But look at what it says here. I want to emphasize this part of the article here. Moscow, Mr. Trump told them, was ready to halt hostilities under a deal involving a territorial exchange. Now remember, months ago, remember what the Trump administration said. I think it was either Hegseth or Mr. Rubio or both. Regardless, the Trump administration made it very clear months ago that territorial concessions will have to be made in order for peace to be settled. So, listen, I could be wrong. Maybe this deal will come to nothing. Maybe America will say, F this Putin guy, blah, blah, blah. But I have difficulty believing that this meeting was scheduled without any sort of agreements being made beforehand. Because what I read is that when you have these massive diplomatic meetings, agreements are already made before the meetings are even carried out. So that way, the meetings are done smoothly and without any pressure. And then after the meetings, the agreements that were made before the meetings are announced to give the impression to the public that the meetings really did do something. This is what I read. And so agreements, if we are to understand this protocol, if we are to accept this protocol, agreements between Russia and the United States have already been made. The question is, what are those agreements going to be? What are those agreements? That's the question. And months ago, the Trump administration made it very clear. Concessions will have to be made. I'm pretty certain it was Hegseth who said this. Concessions will have to be made. What are those concessions? Territorial concessions. Listen, Russia's got the upper hand. They got the most nukes more than anyone else. They got a massive military. They're planning on making like a 5 million man army. They're recruiting all the young people in Russia. They can continue on this war for a long time. Also, Russia has the Oroshnik, and it has a bunch of other missiles that are really scary. And if you don't believe me, just look up Oroshnik on X/Twitter. That damn thing looks like Zeus was striking lightning bolts on Ukraine. They struck Ukraine with the Oroshnik. That damn thing looks like lightning bolts. It doesn't even look like a missile. It's a lightning bolt. It's scary. It's very scary. It's like a little mini nuke. So they don't want to mess with that. So Russia really scared everyone with that Oroshnik. They really frightened everyone with that Oroshnik. And Trump said, hey, if Russia doesn't stop by August 10th, then we're going to have some real problems. I'm going to impose sanctions. And August 10th came and ain't nothing happened. Oh, well, I'm going to give them another deadline. And that deadline came, ain't nothing happened. Oh, well, India, stop buying Russian oil. Why? India is closer to Russia than most of the United States is to Russia. Why the hell should we listen to you? Of course we're going to buy that cheap Russian oil and that cheap Russian grain. Well, we're going to put a 50% tariff on India. Well, that's not good. That's going to hurt Russia's economic partner. So Russia definitely doesn't like that. So they agreed to have this meeting. But because they had such a watershed meeting, agreements were already made. Mr. Trump just brought into play two of Kiev's deepest fears, that it would be forced to cede land to Russia as part of a peace deal, and that Mr. Putin would be given a way out of his diplomatic isolation. Ooh, we can't have Russia get out of isolation. No, we have to make sure that Russia stays isolated. We don't want Russia to be isolated. We don't want Russia to get out of isolation, so they want to make Russia weak. The bottom line is that it's not working. Isolating Russia is not exactly working. You know why? Because Russia is a self-sufficient country. It grows its own wheat. It grows a lot of its own agriculture. It has oil. It has natural gas. It's got a lot of natural resources. And with its territorial expansion into Ukraine, it has even more resources. So you can isolate Russia all you want. It's still going to be a very powerful country. Plus, it has over 5,000 nukes. Russia is going to be a very powerful country. Isolation is not going to work. Well, we have to isolate it even more. Why? So that people can't buy its cheap but very useful and important natural resources? Doesn't make any sense. It's not a viable, nor is it a realistic plan. Kiev is facing its biggest nightmare. Russia getting territorial concessions from Kiev, and possibly, maybe, a trade deal between the U.S. and Russia. That could happen. If it does happen, it's going to be a little while before that happens, but it could happen. It was a direct challenge, the article says. It was a direct challenge to Ukraine's core principles that territorial issues be addressed only after a ceasefire. Only after a ceasefire, and that no deal be concluded without Kiev. Okay, so they want no concessions from Ukraine without, unless there's a ceasefire. We don't want. Actually, no, that's not what they're saying. What they're saying is we don't want to discuss anything else until there's a ceasefire. So America's going to say, okay, Russia, let's do a ceasefire. Russia's going to say, okay, what are we going to get out of it? Well, we're not going to agree on anything unless we have another meeting and Kiev is present and Zelensky is present. Okay, so let's say they have a follow-up meeting and Zelensky is present. Now what? What are they going to do? Zelensky's going to say, hold on, he has to sniff cocaine before such a meeting. Putin, you monster, we're not going to give up any land. And Russia, Putin is just going to say, oh, and what? What are you going to do? You're just going to lose some more. So either you make concessions or we're just going to keep fighting you. And more people are going to die. What do you want to do? Pick your poison. No matter how you look at it, Kiev / Ukraine / Mr. Cocaine Zelensky are the losers in this whole quagmire of death and mayhem and this whole blender of gore and carnage. So it says here that Russia now seems to be more inclined. This is what Mr. Zelensky said. He said, Russia now seems to be more inclined towards a ceasefire. The pressure is working. But, he cautioned, the key is to ensure they don't receive anyone in the details. Don't deceive anyone in the details, neither us nor the United States. So it says here, crucially, Kiev leaned heavily on its European allies to form a united front and relay its message to the Trump administration. The goal was to build a common position with the Europeans and a way to communicate it to Trump. Alexander Krayev, the director of the North American program at the Kiev Research Group Ukrainian Prism, said, these long-ass names for these freaking nonprofits, these think tanks, oh my gosh. Director of the North America program at the Kiev Research Group Ukrainian Prism. How exhausting it is to read these long-ass categories. Said in an interview, the Europeans have been really useful in helping Ukraine get back to the table. Right. Ukraine's first task is to determine exactly what Moscow had proposed to end the war. Mr. Trump had been vague on the call. The official. Why was Trump vague? Because he knows if he wasn't vague, he would probably be saying something that would piss off the Europeans. The officials briefed on it said, leaving it unclear which territories might be swapped. So what does that tell us? The Europeans are going to say, look, we're sort of in this. We're not sort of. We are in this zone of suspense and uncertainty. And our ally, America, is not really being open with us. We can't really rely on the Americans. This is why Germany has to come back and be strong again. Okay. Mr. Zelensky instructed his top aides to clarify the situation. They got on a call last Thursday with European counterparts and Steve Witkoff, Mr. Trump's special envoy for peace missions, who had received Moscow's proposal during a meeting with Mr. Putin in Moscow last week. But Mr. Witkoff's explanations were muddled, according to the Kiev-based European diplomat. So Mr. Witkoff was also vague and sort of ambiguous. He wasn't really being open about what the Americans had in mind. And again, this is all going to be used as propaganda fodder by the Europeans. Can we rely on the Americans? Can we get clear messaging and clear signals from the Americans? No, we keep getting mixed signals because we cannot trust these people. You see, after that second call, it became clear that Moscow was not actually offering to relinquish any land. Well, of course Moscow's not going to offer to relinquish any land. Why would it? It got this land through bloodshed. It got this land through sacrificing Russian soldiers. All that fighting, why in the hell would they concede any sort of territory? They're the winners. So it says here that Moscow was not actually offering to relinquish any land, but only demanding that Kiev give up the territory it holds in the Donbass in exchange for a ceasefire that would freeze the current front lines elsewhere. So Russia's demands are very realistic and very expected. You want a ceasefire? Okay. Give up land. That's it. So it says here that the Russian proposal was a non-starter for Ukraine. And Kiev moved to convince the Americans that it was a dangerous gambit. Do not make any sort of territorial concessions, America. Well, if you don't make territorial concessions, you're not going to have a serious peace. If Russia took all Donbass, Ukrainian officials argued, it would gain control of cities and fortifications, forming Ukraine's main defensive belt in the area. That would put the Russian army in a much stronger position to attack nearby regions. Okay, but they're attacking you right now. So do you want them just to continue attacking you, or do you want to actually have some sort of a negotiation? You don't have any. There's no third option here. There's only two options. Well, they're going to attack us. They're going to attack Western Ukraine. If they get Donbass, then they're just going to attack. They're going to start attacking the rest of Ukraine. But they're attacking you right now. So what do you want to do? Well, we want America to get boots on the ground. That ain't going to happen, at least not right now. So there's no third option here. So it says here, at first, Kiev kept Russia's proposal under wraps, worried about how Ukrainians would react, said Mr. Krayev, the Ukraine researcher. Most Ukrainians oppose giving up any territory not already under Russian control or formally recognizing Moscow's occupation. So the Ukrainians are opposed to giving up any land that's not under Russian control, which is probably the reason why not too long after this Alaska summit was announced, the Russians went into third gear in their advancing into more Ukrainian territory, because the Russians want to take as much as they can before any sort of potential deal, before potentially any deal could be made. The question is, what's going to happen if Ukraine actually concedes territory? What's going to happen to Mr. Zelensky's status in Ukraine? He will be praised maybe by just the average folks in Ukraine who are tired of the killing, but he will be hated by the nationalists. He will be hated by the hardliners. And those hardliners are going to say, look, the Jew comedian has stabbed us in the back. And they're going to be talking in a way that is very reminiscent to how Erich Ludendorff and Adolf Hitler talked after World War I. The Jews stabbed us in the back. And Mr. Zelensky is going to have to fly away. And who knows? There may be reports about, where is Mr. Zelensky? What are his whereabouts? Where did he go? Did he go to Australia? Did he go to China? Did he go to Europe? And then a month later, he's going to do a video upload on X saying, I'm okay, guys. I'll be fine. I'll be fine. Okay. But after Mr. Trump disclosed on Friday that a peace deal could include some swapping of territories, Mr. Zelensky had little choice but to push back. Ukrainians will not gift their land to the occupier. Well, you know what? Tell that to the Palestinians. Palestinians have been occupied for how long? For a long 60-something years? 67 years? Almost 70 years? And the Americans are still backing the occupier. They don't give a shit about occupations and occupiers and who the occupied are. They don't give a damn. What matters is interests. Politics is extremely Machiavellian, and it is very ruthlessly pragmatic. Mr. Zelensky, however, appears to have not entirely ruled out possible territorial exchanges, telling reporters this week that this is a very complex issue that cannot be separated from security guarantees for Ukraine. To bolster its stance with the Americans, Ukraine continued to enlist its European allies. So if the Americans start saying, okay, listen, we're going to make peace with the Russians, we'll have to have some territorial concessions, the Europeans are going to get closer to the Ukrainians are going to get closer to the Europeans. They're going to deepen their ties with the Europeans, and the Europeans are going to say, "Oh, America's not reliable. America couldn't help you. Come here, Ukraine. Come here. We'll baby you." And the Europeans will say, "We have our new baby here, Ukraine." And the Germans are going to be eyeing Ukraine just like they eyed Ukraine in both world wars. Governments may change, politicians change, parties change. Geopolitics does not change. Over the past week, Mr. Zelensky spoke by phone with more than 20 European leaders, including several times with President Emmanuel Macron of France, a close ally. The strategy, and remember, France had a war with Russia not some centuries ago with Napoleon. It was between Napoleon and Russia. We all know that. That strategy echoed a familiar tactic first applied this spring when European leaders repeatedly engaged with Mr. Trump to press Ukraine's case during early rounds of peace talks and acted as troubleshooter during moments of tension between Kiev and Washington. So when you had tensions between Trump and Zelensky, between Washington and Kiev, there were the Europeans to be the middlemen to help the Ukrainians. Why? Because Germany sees Ukraine as territory that belongs to its sphere of influence. That's how I'll put it. On Saturday, senior European and Ukrainian officials met outside London with top American officials, including Vice President J.D. Vance, to try to dissuade the United States from cutting a peace deal with Russia behind their backs. Now, if a peace deal is made and territory is relinquished, I'm telling you right now, it is going to be used as propaganda fodder by the Europeans to say, we can't trust the Americans. We have to be the stewards of Europe. European leaders reiterated their key principles that a ceasefire must come first, that the current front lines should be the starting point for any negotiations, including on territorial issues, and that any deal would have to be accompanied by security guarantees for Kiev. Now, by security guarantees, NATO is on their minds. When they bring up security guarantees, they're thinking about NATO. The thing is that Russia has made it very clear that in order to have peace, it must be guaranteed that Ukraine will not be allowed to join NATO. The entire war began over this issue of Ukraine potentially joining NATO. And the Russians have made it very emphatically clear that any sort of peace deal must stipulate that Ukraine will never be allowed to join NATO. So then what is it going to be? In my opinion, if a deal is made, my prediction is that the United States are going to tell the United States is going to tell the Europeans, Europe, you're going to have to be Ukraine's security guarantee. The Europeans have talked about putting troops in Ukraine. And Mr. Putin and Mr. Peskov have made it very clear that EU troops setting foot on Ukraine will be seen as no different than NATO troops setting foot on Ukraine. And the EU having a military presence in Ukraine will be seen no differently from NATO troops being present in Ukraine. So what is going to happen? How are they going to do this? That's the big question. My opinion is the Americans are going to tell the Europeans, you guys watch over Ukraine security. We're going to focus on the Chinese. How are the Europeans going to do this? What is a given is that they're going to provide weapons and munitions to the Ukrainians. And I wouldn't be surprised to see in the future the Europeans just declare war on Russia. And they're going to say, if such a thing happens, they're going to say, Slava Ukraina! Ukrainium Slava, Herodium Slava, for the glory of Ukraine, and really for the natural gas and for the very fertile soil on the Black Sea region. Ukraine, Slavu. Remember we were hearing that bullshit all 2022? Seriously, the invasion of Ukraine just cured the world of COVID. Remember, the world. We were all being killed by a pestilence. There was a great plague. It was the Black Plague of our time, 2020, 2021. The world was being ravished by this horrible disease, COVID, and then there was Omicron and blah blah blah. Russia literally cured the world of COVID because once he invaded Ukraine, I stopped hearing about COVID. COVID just packed up its things and said, "All right, Russia, you take over. You're the next disaster. My shift is done." And he just packed his bags and left. No more COVID. The world literally got cured of COVID in February of 2022. Hell, I'm not joking. I went on a date just literally a couple days after Russia invaded Ukraine. I went out on a date. No mask. Nothing. Why? Russia liberated us from COVID. Russia was like, we're going to liberate Ukraine from Nazis. What we all fail to acknowledge is the fact that Russia liberated the world from freaking COVID. It wasn't the vaccine. It was Russia that saved us because I stopped hearing about it. And I went on that date on a winter's night when they all said, supposedly flu season. During the flu season, I went on a date on a winter's night in February of 2022. No masks. Nobody was wearing a mask. And then the week later, I went on another date on a winter's night to a restaurant. No masks. Because we all got liberated by Russia. They liberated the world from the Nazis, and they liberated us from COVID. Thank you, Russia. All right. But you see, as there is talks between the Americans and the Russians, the Europeans are still bent on conspiring for war with the Russians. And look at what it says here. European leaders treated Wednesday's video call with Trump like a win, perhaps because he didn't explicitly tell them off for once. But they really have no idea what he'll actually discuss with Putin, nor do they have leverage over any eventual U.S.-Russia deal. They don't know whether Trump is just placating them because he doesn't need a bunch of hysterical circus clowns in the mix. So how could the EU spin this to avoid looking completely irrelevant? Today, Europe, the U.S., and NATO have strengthened the common ground for Ukraine. We will remain in close coordination. Nobody wants peace more than us. A just and lasting peace, said unelected EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Yeah, sounds desperate for peace, all right. Which must be why the EU is building weapons factories at breakneck speed, according to the Financial Times. Nothing says we're committed to ending the war like tripling down on weapons. What are you going to do with all those if peace breaks out? Toss them in the landfill and hope that taxpayers forget about the boondoggle like you did with the hundreds of millions of unused COVID jabs? So, the Europeans are not interested in peace. They are interested in preparing for war with the Russians. And it says here that, in particular, Russia has focused on the prospect of discussing arms control and restoring economic ties with the United States. Mr. Putin said he believed that the United States was making quite energetic efforts to stop the fighting, end the crisis, and reach agreements of interest to all parties involved in this conflict. He added that an agreement on Ukraine, quote, would create long-term conditions of peace between our countries in Europe and in the world as a whole if we reach agreements in the next stages in the field of strategic offensive arms control. So it says here that the Nuclear Arms Reduction Treaty, signed in 2011 during a brief thaw between the two countries, is set to expire next February. Now, this is very interesting because what happened not too long ago? The United States announced that it would be setting up what are known as, I think they're called BM-3 interceptors, so basic missile interceptors in Germany. And the Russians said, listen, if you set up those missile interceptors in Germany, we are going to see that as a threat to Russia because those interceptors can be used to fire long-range missiles into Russia. We don't like that. And so the Russians announced that they would no longer restrain themselves in their setting up of long-range missiles in Russia or in Belarus. And they're talking about setting up intermediate range missiles. And they're talking about no longer restraining themselves in the setting up of such weapons technology. And this happened not too long before the Alaska summit was announced. So it's obvious that one of the reasons as to why this summit was announced was because of these announcements. The announcements by the United States to set up missile interceptors in Germany, and the announcement by Russia to no longer observe restraints on Russia setting up intermediate range missiles. And so the Nuclear Arms Reduction Treaty, which was signed in 2011, is going to expire next February. So who knows what will come about from that. But it says here that an exchange of views is expected on the further development of bilateral cooperation, including on the trade and economic sphere. I would like to note that this cooperation has a huge and unfortunately untapped potential, which is true. And it says here that Mr. Ushakov also announced which Russian officials would be part of the delegation. And their names, or one of their names, are Kirill Dmitriev, Mr. Putin's envoy on foreign investment and economic cooperation, and the defense minister, Andrei Belousov. The inclusion of Mr. Belousov and Mr. Dmitriev in the Russian delegation was another indication that the Kremlin hoped to discuss economic matters at the summit. So who knows what's going to happen? It's possible that we will see trade relations open up again between the Americans and the Russians. And what the hell happened to my music? Let's see. European leaders praised Trump for offering U.S. military support for future peace force in Ukraine. So are the Americans really interested in peace, or are they looking for an armistice? That's the question here. And it looks like the Americans are being... Doesn't look like. I think it's clear that the Americans are being deceptive. If they do want peace, it's a pause. It's a pause in the fighting to help the Europeans out. That's what I suspect is happening. But again, if they really want peace, that's great. But if they really wanted peace, then why are they talking about providing U.S. military support? Maybe they're lying. Hopefully they're lying. Hopefully. But it says here that European leaders have praised Donald Trump for agreeing to allow U.S. military support for a force they are mustering to police any future peace in Ukraine. This is going to be very interesting. European leaders have praised President Donald Trump for agreeing to allow U.S. military support for a force they are mustering to police any future peace in Ukraine. The question is this going to be allowed by the Russians? That's the question. Because the Russians have made it clear. Peskov and Lavrov and the rest of these guys, they have made it very clear. No EU, no Western, no European soldiers in Ukraine. No, especially no freaking German soldiers. We dealt with those guys 80 plus years ago. We don't want those guys coming back to Ukraine. We don't want no Polish soldiers coming and entering Ukraine. None of that stuff. And the Russians have made it clear that any European military activities in Ukraine will be seen as no differently than NATO military activities. End of story. And they have made it very clear that if an EU soldier makes one step into Ukraine, it is going to be seen as an act of war. This is what they have said. So how are they going to do this? That's my question. Listen, I wouldn't be surprised to see one day in the future Germany just straight up declare war on Russia. Just like straight up, we're doing it. America, you keep restraining us. We're done. We're just going to do it. And America's going to say, oh, no, please, no, don't. Sorry. I let go of the leash. The dog has been unleashed. The leaders said Trump offered American military backup for the European Reassurance Force during a call they held with him ahead of his planned summit. So before this meeting in Alaska occurred, they wanted a call with Trump because they wanted to make sure that the Americans weren't going to make any sort of territorial concession. So we gotta call up Trump. So Trump said, yes, we'll have an American military backup to help your pan-European reassurance force. They did not say what the assistance might involve, and Trump himself has not publicly confirmed any support. So it could be a complete act of subterfuge on behalf of the Americans. The effectiveness of the operation, drawn up by the coalition of about 30, the coalition of the willing, Keir Starmer's coalition of the willing, by the coalition of about 30 countries supporting Ukraine, hinges on the deterrent effect of U.S. air power or other military equipment that European armed forces do not have or have only in short supply. No U.S. troops would be involved, but the threat of American air power, if needed, behind the European force would likely help to dissuade Russian troops from testing Europe's resolve. Now, remember, there was a minerals deal that was made between the United States and Russia, and what did Trump say? Trump said, okay, Europe, you can't have your military presence in Ukraine. You can't do this plan that you want to do, but here's what we're going to do. We're going to have American businesses operate in Ukraine. And those businesses are going to be a security reassurance unto themselves, because if Russia attacks those businesses, then we will have no choice but to go to war with Russia. That's going to be your security guarantee. And I think it's very likely that they're just going to carry on with the minerals deal. And America is going to say, hey, we're going to have our businesses in Ukraine. We're going to exploit the resources. Russia, you're going to exploit the resources. We're both going to make money. I'm going to make money. You're going to make money. And we're both going to make money. And the presence of American industry in Ukraine will be a security assurance unto itself. That I can see happening, because I'm just having difficulty seeing the German armed forces deploying into Ukraine to defend Ukraine against Russia. I'm just having difficulty seeing this because the Russians have made it clear it'll be seen as an act of war. So how are they going to do this? And I could totally see Donald Trump saying, all right, we're not going to have European troops, but we'll have American businesses. And then Trump will tell the Europeans exactly what he told them last time. So it says here that the European force would likely help to dissuade Russian troops from testing Europe's resolve. Senior Russian officials have repeatedly rejected the idea of European peacekeepers in Ukraine. EU leaders have regularly underlined how the United States is crucial to the success of the security operation dubbed Multinational Force Ukraine. But the Trump administration has long refused to commit, perhaps keeping its participation on hold as leverage in talks with Russia. So the United States is saying, we don't really want to get involved in this. And the reason, partially, I think, is because America wants to focus more on China. Why do they want to get bogged down in this European quagmire when they could just be focusing most of their resources and most of their time on focusing on an even bigger threat to American hegemony, and that is China? EU leaders have regularly underlined how the United States is crucial to the success of the security operation dubbed Multinational Force Ukraine. Okay, I already read that. But that is really fun to do. European Council President Antonio Costa welcomed the readiness of the United States to share with Europe the efforts to reinforce security conditions once we obtain a durable and just peace for Ukraine. Okay. French President Emmanuel Macron said Trump insisted that NATO cannot be part of such security measures. So Trump told the Frenchies, listen, Frenchies, NATO can't be involved in putting troops in Ukraine. That's gonna make a mess out of any deal with Russia. But he said the U.S. leader agreed that the United States, los Estados Unidos, and all the other parties involved should take part. They should take part. They should take part in Europe's security. But are they going to take part? That is the question. More than 200 military planners have worked for months on ways to ensure a future peace, should the war, now in its fourth year, finally end. It could number 10 to 30,000 troops. The mission will be to strengthen Ukraine's defenses on the land and sea, in the air, because the Ukrainian armed forces are the best deterrent against future Russian aggression, UK Defense Secretary John Healey told lawmakers last month. Western trainers will work with Ukrainian troops. Now, if the Europeans are not allowed to put soldiers in Ukraine, what they will do is send a bunch of weapons and trainers to the Ukrainians. They'll send trainers. They will send munitions, ammunition, weapons to the Ukrainians to strengthen their resolve. And if a war breaks out again, I'm telling you, I wouldn't be surprised to see Germany just straight up declare war on the Russians. It will secure Ukraine's skies by using aircraft, and it will support safer seas by bolstering the Black Sea Task Force with additional specialist teams. Black Sea Task Force? Really? Oh my God. Black Sea Task Force. Guys, we are getting into some seriously heavy geopolitical territory here. Black Sea Task Force. Black Sea. That's something that's part of Russia's sphere of influence. They want to mess with the Russians in the Black Sea, which means that the Europeans cannot go into a serious conflict with the Russians without an alliance, a military alliance with the Turks. Oh, because what is NATO's big wild card in the Black Sea? What's Europe's wild card in the Black Sea? It ain't Romania. It's Turkey. Because Turkey controls access into the Bosphorus Strait. Turkey controls access into the Sea of Marmara. Turkey controls access into the Aegean Sea, and thereby controls access from the Mediterranean from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. So Turkey also has the second biggest military in NATO. Turkey also has the biggest military in the Middle East. Turkey has the biggest military, or one of the biggest militaries in Europe, because it's partially in the Middle East, partially in Europe. And it can and it's a huge part of the Black Sea. It's in competition with the Russians over the Black Sea, which means there's going to be a military alliance between the Europeans, really the Germans, and the Turks. This is why the British have been working with the Turks to develop Turkey's first fifth-generation fighter jet, the Cant fighter jet. The British have been involved in the production of that fighter jet. They want to work with the Turks in the Black Sea against the Russians. Just like the British backed the Turks in the Crimean War, in which they defeated the Russians. And the Russians lost control over Anatolia. And the Russians were prevented from ruling over Constantinople and retaking the Hagia Sophia for the Orthodox world. And so this really sheds more light upon the U.S. brokered deal between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Because Turkey has this immense leverage in Europe, immense leverage in the Black Sea, which means that it is necessary to make an alliance with Turkey if you are going to fight against Russia over the Black Sea. Which means it is necessary to empower Turkey. And that is why the United States is greenlighting Turkey's aspiration for establishing a direct trade route from itself through Nakhchivan, through Armenia, through mainland Azerbaijan into the Caspian Sea, thus establishing a direct trade route between Turkey and Central Asia, because Turkey wants to control the Caspian Sea. And by empowering Turkey to that level, it'll empower both the Turks and the Europeans against the Russians, because the Europeans will then have a direct trade route that they could use to import resources such as oil and natural gas from Central Asia, thereby bypassing the Russians. So empowering Turkey is extremely necessary. That's what I'm saying. But they're talking about a Black Sea Task Force, which is quite amazing. Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey launched that naval force a year ago to deal with mines in Black Sea waters. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov recently said peacekeepers in Ukraine would be just as unacceptable for Moscow as Ukraine's membership in NATO. The appearance of troops, armed forces from the same NATO countries, but under a foreign flag, under the flag of European Union or national flags, does not change anything in this regard. This is, of course, unacceptable to us, Lavrov said. European efforts to set up the force have been seen at a first test of the continent's willingness to defend itself and its interest. Given the Trump administration warnings that Europe must take care of its own security and that of Ukraine in the future. So why do they want the Europeans to handle Ukraine security? As I've said many times, the Trump administration, America, really wants to focus more on China. Still, U.S. forces clearly provide a deterrent that the Europeans cannot muster. And the phone is ringing yet again. Hold on. Russian military breaks into Petropavlovka. So they're still taking territory. And the reason is because they want to take as much territory before any sort of potential ceasefire could be done. But it says here that assault units of the 1st Tank Army of the Russian Armed Forces have broken through to Petropavlovka in the Kupiansk direction in the Kharkov region. According to information from the field, the settlement is currently being cleared. This means that Kupiansk itself is practically in a cauldron and is already in operational encirclement. With this maneuver, the Russian army commander deceived the expectations of the enemy, who was strengthening the southern flank of the direction. Expecting a classic encirclement of the city, and the crisis in the Petrovsk region forced the Ukrainian armed forces to withdraw the best units, etc. So they're still taking territory, is my whole point, and the Russians are the winners in this whole game. So 3 painful compromises for Kiev at the Alaska summit have been named. So this article is saying here are the compromises that Ukraine is going to have to make, okay? So it says here that Ukraine will suffer only one kind of defeat as a result of the talks between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. This point of view was expressed by Kiev observer Vitaly Portnikov. According to him, Russia will not suffer any damage as a result of the meeting between Putin and Trump. This is what Mr. Portnikov had to say. It says here that Russian troops are on the offensive. Aviation, ballistics, and drones can hit Ukrainian cities every day. Ukraine currently controls virtually no territory of the Russian Federation. One subtype of defeat. Ukraine finally realizes that the territory occupied by Russia will remain under Russian control. So this Russian analyst, Mr. I can't remember this guy's name, Mr. Vitaly Portnikov is saying Russia's going to have to make territorial concessions. Bottom line. According to him, the second, no less painful compromise for Kiev will be Trump's conviction of Europeans and Ukrainians that the Ukrainian armed forces must leave the territory of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions. So Trump's conviction of Europeans and Ukrainians that Ukraine's going to have to give up land. Bottom line. So far, the compromise that Ukraine's going to have to make is territorial concessions. He calls the third painful compromise for Ukraine the constitutional changes that exclude Euro-Atlantic integration from the country's basic law and turn Ukraine into a buffer zone between Russia and the EU. So this is interesting. So this guy is saying Ukraine's going to have to make the compromise wherein it will admit or it will affirm that it will not join NATO and perhaps not even the European Union, and will have to be content with just being the buffer zone between Europe and Russia. And this guy says, Mr. Portnikov, he says, at the same time, no one provides any real security guarantees. And this makes sense, by the way, because I know I've talked a lot about the Europeans wanting to send troops into Ukraine, but the Russians have been very, very clear on this. They're saying, listen, Europe, you take one freaking step into Ukraine, it's going to be an act of war. Bottom line. So are the Europeans just going to willy-nilly send troops into Ukraine? It's doubtful at this point. At this point, it's doubtful because of Russia's seriousness on this issue. So what this Russian guy is saying, what this Russian analyst is saying, is that Ukraine's going to have to be content with just being a buffer zone between Europe and Russia. And if that happens, then the Ukrainians are going to say, okay, we're going to be the buffer zone for now. We're going to be the buffer zone, but we're going to cry about our territories being occupied by the Russians, etc., and we're going to get closer to the Europeans. And the Europeans are going to say, Ukraine is to be secured by us. We are to protect Ukraine, and Russia better stay away from the buffer zone. That is the buffer zone. Russia, you better stay away. And the Europeans are going to get deeper and deeper into ties with the Ukrainians, and the Europeans, especially the Germans, are going to be increasing their military capacity. And on one day, you're going to have a Russo-European war. That's my prediction. So it says here that Trump makes some kind of statement that he considers a guarantee, but everyone understands perfectly well that there will be no real effective steps from the West. Let us add that international observers believe that one way or another, Kiev will have to make territorial concessions following the summit in Alaska. So that's what this guy is saying. That Ukraine will have to make concessions, and I think he is right. I do. I believe he is correct because it's just the obvious solution, and it's the most realistic. It's the only realistic peace plan. And it's just it's the inevitable result of Russia being the winner in all of this. I mean, plain and simple. It really is that simple. So it says here, there's only one topic Putin won't discuss with Trump, the Times. So it says here, the publication adds, so by publication it's talking about the Times of London. The Times of London, a very noble publication. The publication adds that Trump insists on an exchange of territories. So it looks like Donald Trump is insisting on an exchange of territories. And it says here, however, it is unlikely that Putin will give up his territorial gains along the Black and Azov Seas as they provide a land bridge to Crimea. And what's right across from Ukraine on the Black Sea? Turkey is. So Russia is going to consolidate its control over southern Ukraine. It's going to deepen its control over Crimea. It's going to further solidify its control over Crimea by maintaining control over over the territories that it's gotten along the seas of Azov and the Black Sea. And then NATO's going to look to Turkey and say, Turkey, you're right across from those guys. We need you. We need you. And Turkey is going to be the wild card against the Russians. Turkey and Russia are neighbors. They're neighbors on the Caucasus, and they are neighbors at the Black Sea. So it says here that Putin has said that Ukraine's membership in NATO is out of the question. Nothing. No membership to Ukraine. Nothing. None of that. But Zelensky wants security guarantees. Trump's task will be to find a way to meet Zelensky's demand for security guarantees in a way that is acceptable to Putin. So we don't want to anger the Russians. So we got to do something to placate the Russians while at the same time placating and giving the Ukrainians what they want, and that is security guarantees. So what is this going to be? I suspect Trump is just going to recourse back to what he told the Ukrainians not too long ago, and that is that American companies will be put in place in Ukraine to exploit Ukraine's resources, and those companies will be Ukraine's guarantee for security. That's what I suspect will happen. So it says here that the third topic is the withdrawal of American missiles from Europe. According to the author, Russia wants to reduce the U.S. military presence on the continent, in particular to limit the number of NATO missiles capable of hitting Moscow and St. Petersburg. Now, I talked about this earlier. The United States not too long ago made an announcement that they would be setting up some missile interceptors in Germany. The Russians didn't like this, and the Russians responded to this announcement by saying that they will not be really restraining themselves when they want to set up missiles that could hit Europe. Now, if the Americans start doing some substantial military withdrawals out of Europe, that is going to send the signal to the Europeans, especially the Germans, to increase their military capabilities, to boost their military strength. And this is why I keep saying we got to be really expecting the Fourth Reich to come into existence. Just let me know when the Fourth Reich is here. Okay, given his statements about missiles in Europe, it is likely that Putin will seek to reverse Trump's decision to deploy land-based missiles in Germany and attempt to rewrite the post-Cold War security architecture in his favor. The Kremlin has offered American oil companies the opportunity to resume drilling in Russia as a bonus to any deal. So this could be very appealing to the United States. Trump said some time ago that if Putin does not agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine, that there will be serious consequences. He has already imposed 50% tariffs on imports from India as punishment for buying Russian oil, and said that these charges helped bring Putin to the negotiations. Putin will be keen to ease some of the existing sanctions on Russia and to lift tariffs on imports from India. He may also want to prevent similar tariffs from being imposed on China, another major buyer of Russian oil. Here's how Putin and Trump's Alaska power move will play out. So it says here, it will also be the first time the leaders of Russia and the U.S. have met in Alaska, the closest U.S. state to Russia. Separated only by the narrow Bering Strait and once part of the Russian Empire, the symbolism is obvious, as far as possible from Ukraine and Western Europe, but as close as possible to Russia. And neither Zelensky nor the EU's top brass will be in the room. So, like I said, the choice of Alaska as the meeting place between Putin and Trump is significant. It's a way of saying, we're going to meet in the part of the United States that is closest to Russia. It's a way of saying this is Russia's and America's affair. And this is Russia's and America's place for arbitration. We're going to meet at the halfway point. We're not going to go far away to Europe, and America's not going to travel far away to Moscow, and Russia's not going to travel far away to DC or New York City. We're going to meet at the halfway point. And it was a gesture of, I guess you could say, cooperation. Let's make it easy for ourselves. The message could not be clearer. Moscow and Washington will make the key decisions in Ukraine, then inform others later. As Trump has said, they hold all the cards. And that is what Donald Trump told Zelensky when he and Vance were tag teaming their beration he and Vance were tag teaming in their beration of Mr. Zelensky. You don't have the cards. Putin has the cards. That's what Trump said. And he's right. The Alaska summit marks a sharp departure from the Biden years, when even the idea of such a meeting was unthinkable, and Washington's priority was isolating Russia. Now, not only will Putin travel to Alaska, but Trump is already planning a return visit to Russia. Moderate optimism surrounds the meeting. Summits of this type are rarely held just to talk. They usually cap a long process of behind-the-scenes negotiations. So that's what I was telling you guys. Agreements were already made before the meeting even happened. The question is, what are those agreements? Russian presidential aide Yuri Ushakov described Washington's offer as very acceptable. That suggests Putin and Trump will arrive in Alaska with a preliminary deal, or at least a framework for a truce already in place. So Mr. Yuri Ushakov said that Washington has already made Russia an offer, and that offer is very acceptable to the Russians. So agreements or an agreement has already been made. Trump has good reason to want the summit to succeed. His effort to squeeze Moscow by pushing China and India to stop buying Russian oil has backfired badly. Far from isolating Russia, it triggered the worst U.S.-India crisis in 25 years and drove New Delhi even closer to Moscow. So in the attempt and in the effort to isolate the Russians, the Americans have actually gotten the Russians to be a lot less isolated. This war has actually gotten the Russians an even greater network with other countries. It has actually enabled the Russians to have deeper ties, economic ties with other countries, because other countries want to buy cheap Russian oil and cheap natural gas. So it says here that BRICS, let me make sure you guys can see this. BRICS, which Trump has openly vowed to weaken, has only grown more cohesive. The Alaska summit is Trump's chance to escape the trap he built for himself. So all this, 2D chess bullshit is just that. It's bullshit. Oh, he's doing 2D chess. He's doing this. No. Trump tried to dismantle and weaken BRICS, and he failed. So he has had to resort to an actual diplomatic meeting in Alaska, trying to pressure Moscow through Beijing and New Delhi, and to show results on Ukraine that he can sell as a diplomatic victory. For Moscow, a successful summit would be a powerful demonstration that talk of isolation is obsolete. We are not isolated. Look, the Americans are seeking to talk to us because they want to make a deal with us because we are the winners. They are the ones who want the meeting because we are winning. This is the message that this whole thing sends to the Russians. It would cement Russia's standing with the global majority and highlight Western Europe's diminished influence. Now, this is very significant because this is a humiliation to the Europeans. There was this big major diplomatic meeting. We were never invited. Europe is not significant. Europe has lost its relevance. We have to make Europe relevant again. And so it's almost like the devil has creeped into the soul of Europe and has said, remember that Hitler guy that you guys swore never to follow? That you guys swore to condemn forever? Well, you guys are irrelevant. And there's this little thing called Mein Kampf. Let me just slide this little book slowly to you guys. Remember that Nazi thing that you guys swore to always disavow? How would you like to live a life of relevance and fame and glory? How would you like to live in a world where everyone fears you? This is your time to shine again, Europe. And it reminds me of that scene from The Witch when Black Phillip, the devil, goes to this girl and he says, do you wish to live a life that is as sweet as butter? And he gives the girl this little document and asks her to sign her name with blood. Do you wish to live a life that is rich and fun? And she says yes, and she signs her name and she makes a deal with the devil. That's what this reminds me of. Germany, Europe is in this state of humiliation. It's in this state of irrelevancy. It's in this state of being belittled and ignored. And it wants to be big again. It kind of reminds me of what happened with the Japanese after World War I. You know, there was Japan. Japan was a U.S. ally. It allied with the Americans against the Germans and China. And after World War I, America rose up as the world's superpower, as the world's greatest superpower. And the British were praised, and the British had a seat in the table. The French had a seat in the table. The Russians had a seat in the table. And the Japanese said, hey, where's our seat? And America said, oh, you, Japan, you're one of the yellow men. You're one of the inferior yellow races. So you have no place in the table with us white powers. And the Russians said, fuck you. Sorry, the Japanese said fuck you, not the Russians. That came later on. But the Japanese said F you. And the Japanese wanted to make themselves very relevant and very powerful. And they invaded China eventually. So the Europeans are in a similar situation where they're not really being taken seriously. and they want to be taken seriously. And so the devil is there, because the devil is there to influence not only individuals, but to influence nations and governments. It's like what St. Paul says in Ephesians. We do not war against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against the powers of darkness. And the powers of darkness are there to influence people, and that includes entire nations. That includes governments. And there's the devil to tell the Europeans, it's time for you to become relevant again. Let's get that military powerful again. Let's get those weapons made. Let's get those nuclear bombs. It's time for you guys to become powerful again. It's time for you guys to stop being so damn weak and insignificant. Become strong again, Germany. Remember your ancestors. Which ancestors? You know which ones. I don't have to name them to you. You know which ancestors. Remember your ancestors. Return to your former glory. And the devil wants this to happen because the devil wants human life to destroy itself as much as possible, because the devil is at war with humanity. The devil is at war with us. That's the bottom line. So it says here that the transatlantic split would widen, weakening Brussels' claim to be Russia's toughest opponent. So Brussels is saying, we're Russia's toughest opponent. And the Americans are saying, no, you're not. We're Russia's toughest opponent. That's why we're in the negotiating table with Russia. That's why we're arbitrating a deal over Ukraine with Russia, not you, Belgium, not you, Brussels. So this is incentivizing the Europeans to become powerful again. And this is especially true for the Germanic countries. Germany, the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Netherlands. Washington today has little real leverage over Russia, especially on Ukraine. If the summit yields a joint Russian army vision for a truce or settlement, it will inevitably reflect Russia's position more than Kiev's or Brussels. Western Europe, for its part, will be watching from the sidelines. Oh, poor Germany. Watching from the sidelines. Its leaders are scrambling for scraps of information via secondary channels. The optics will underline a... Look at this. The optics will underline a humiliating reality. For the first time in almost a century, decisions about Europe's security will be made without the likes of Italy, France, and Germany in the room. This is ignominy. This is humiliation. And the Europeans hate humiliation. The Germans were humiliated after World War I. And they said, nope, we're not going to be humiliated. And you had the German war machine of the Second World War. And the Germans are going to rise. I'm telling you, they're going to rise again. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And everyone doubts me. Everyone except for a few doubt me. And it doesn't matter, because history is a force that you cannot beat. Is it going to be the end of NATO? I don't know. What I do know is that you're going to have a European Leviathan. Whether or not it will be a part of NATO, time will tell. That's something that the future will tell us. So it says here why Putin and Trump had to talk in person. And look at what it says here. History shows that even when top-level meetings do occur, they rarely change the overall course of international politics. So just because there was this meeting, and if there were other meetings, it doesn't mean that there's going to be this serious peace between Russia and the Western world. So it says here, it is no surprise then that the Alaska meeting has been compared to famous encounters from the past. Notably, the 1807 meeting between the Russian and French emperors on a raft in the Nerman River. That summit did not prevent Napoleon from attacking Russia 5 years later. So there was a big meeting, a big summit between the French emperor and the Russian emperor, and it didn't prevent war from breaking out between the Russians and the French 5 years later. And so it says here, history is full of high-level talks that preceded war rather than preventing it. European monarchs would meet, fail to agree, and then march their armies. In 2021, in the 2021 Geneva summit between Russia and the U.S. Okay, hold on. The 2021 Geneva summit between Russia and the U.S. may well be remembered in this way. As a meeting that took place on the eve of confrontation, both sides left convinced their disputes could not be resolved at the time. In its aftermath, Kiev was armed, sanctions were readied, and Moscow accelerated military technical preparations. And war broke out in 2022. That's the reality. Russia's own history offers parallels. The most famous summit of ancient Rus was the 971 meeting between Prince Sviatoslav and Byzantine Emperor John Tzimiskis, following a peace treaty. According to historian Nikolai Karamzin, they parted as friends, but that did not stop the Byzantines from unleashing the Pechenegs against Sviatoslav on his journey home. So the Russians and the Byzantines had a peace summit, and then the Greeks attacked through their proxy, the Pechenegs, who were a barbaric Turkic people. So big summits, big meetings like this doesn't mean that there's going to be a serious peace, sadly enough.